We just recently saw the end of the high-level week of the United Nations General Assembly. And if you're like me, a diplomacy nerd, this is like the World Cup of diplomacy. But what exactly is the UN General Assembly and what are its functions? Today, we will give you an introduction and highlight the major moments of this year's UNGA with insights from our guest, Professor and Analyst of International Relations, Mr. Mirko Dautovic. Before we jump into the interview, let's take a moment for some background. The UN General Assembly, often referred to as the Parliament of the World, is one of the 6 main organs of the United Nations. Established in 1945, shortly after the end of World War II, the UNGA was created to promote peace, security, cooperation among nations. Each of the member states has an equal vote in the Assembly, making it a global stage where countries can address issues that affect the global community. The Assembly's responsibilities are extensive, ranging from international peace and security, the promotion of human rights, the economic development, to tackling climate change, humanitarian crises, and public health concerns. It serves not only as a forum for discussion, but also as a platform for decision-making. While the resolutions adopted by the General Assembly aren't legally binding, they carry immense political weight. Historically, the General Assembly has played an important role in international cooperation, from adopting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 to guiding the global agenda on sustainable development. This year was the 79th session of the UN General Assembly, with critical discussions and decisions focused on today's most urgent global challenges. The session was marked by discussions on sustainable development, technological inequality, international peace and security, reforming global governance, and the inclusion of youth and future generations in shaping the future. One of the key achievements of this year was the adoption of the Pact for the Future.
The Pact for the Future, the Global Digital Compact, and the Declaration on Future Generations open pathways to new possibilities and opportunities,
which is a transformative agreement aimed at modernizing global governance. This pact seeks to ensure that international institutions are equipped to respond effectively to contemporary realities. It introduced the Global Digital Compact, which aims to bridge the global digital divide and regulate the use of emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, ensuring that these technologies are used for the benefit of all. Additionally, the Declaration on Future Generations was adopted, committing the global community to consider the voices and interests of young people in decision-making processes that will impact their future. Aside from these structural reforms, this year's Assembly featured important discussions on climate change, poverty, the need for stronger international cooperation to reduce inequalities. Uzbekistan also had a highly productive week, strengthening its ties by signing new relations with 7 countries and engaging in economic, social, and trade discussions with several other nations. On the geopolitical front, the war in Gaza and the ongoing conflict in Ukraine were dominant topics throughout the session. The UNGA voted on a resolution calling for Israel to end its occupation of Palestine, with 124 countries voting in favor, 14 voting against, and 43 abstaining. Tensions were particularly high during this debate, with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu making headlines by calling the UN General Assembly a house of darkness and a swamp of anti-Semitic bile.
This UN house of darkness is home court. They know that in this swamp of anti-Semitic bile, there's an automatic majority willing to demonize the Jewish state on anything. In this anti-Israel flat earth society,
many state leaders and representatives walked out during his speech, which underscores the deep divisions on this issue. To provide more in-depth analysis and expert opinion on these developments, we are delighted to welcome Mr. Mirko Dautovic, Professor and Analyst of International Relations, who will share his thoughts on this year's UN General Assembly. Mr. Dautovic, thank you for agreeing to come and talk to us. So I'd like to start by talking about the United Nations General Assembly in general. So we just recently saw the end of the high-level week, which is the 79th session of the UN General Assembly. And can you tell me what's the significance of the UN General Assembly as a platform for international cooperation?
So thank you for the invitation, Mr. Bakhodirov. And the United Nations General Assembly happens, or each September, it opens each new session. And it is an occasion where the heads of state and heads of government of the entire world are coming and making speeches and seeing each other eye to eye. So it's a summit of world leaders, if you will. All members of the UN, so all 193, come for this occasion to New York, and they discuss. So it's effectively like a parliament of the world, the Supreme Council of our planet, where our species, the leaders of our species, get together to talk and to meet and cooperate. This is how the agreements are best made, face to face, eye to eye.
So considering everything that's happening around the world, especially in the Middle East, the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, what do you think were the most important topics and maybe decisions that were made and covered during the high-level week?
So this depends on the point of view of each country. So if you would read or listen to the speeches of the world leaders, you would hear what are the priorities in their speeches for their countries. So for instance, of course, for France, if you would read the President Macron's speech, it was Gaza, but also Ukraine, right? So both of these conflicts feature heavily for him. But if you read for, let's say, Chinese Foreign Minister Lin Jian's speech, Gaza was prominent, Ukraine not so much, while most of the speech was dedicated to the climate change and measures that China is taking to switch to the renewable sources of energy, and therefore thereby contribute to the lessening of the CO2 emissions. So you see, each country, therefore, through their speeches, it symbolizes, it signals which issues are at its heart.
Thank you. And I feel like one of the dominant topics was also the conflict in Gaza, the war in Gaza, whatever people say. And there was the resolution. They voted for a resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza, in all the Palestinian territories. 124 countries voted in favor, 14 countries voted against, and 43 abstained. What do you think are the practical implications of this resolution? Is it going to change anything, or anything is going to happen at all?
Nothing, I'm afraid. So you see, the United Nations General Assembly resolutions are not binding resolutions. The resolutions of the UN Security Council, the body of the 15 selected countries with the 5 permanent members, their resolutions are binding. And in the Security Council, you have vetoes. Concerning Gaza, United States is going to place a veto on any resolution even remotely critical of Israel or requiring a ceasefire without condemning Hamas and now Hezbollah and Iran, while in the General Assembly you don't have vetoes. So you can pass these resolutions, which are hostile to Israel, United States, but they have no effect. And not only that, the resolutions of the Security Council, which are binding, Israel has decades of history of ignoring these resolutions. So, even if the Security Council passed a resolution asking for a ceasefire, Israel would probably ignore it.
I see. Then what would you say is the point of, calling for or voting for a resolution if it has no way of enforcement?
It's part of the theater of diplomacy. So you want to raise your flag to some cause or lower it. So if there is, for instance, in this case, Gaza, of course, the entire Middle East and the Muslim world is very passionate about this issue. And they want to see countries care for this issue, just like Europeans want the world to care about Ukraine, for example. So by voting this, it's also a method for you to show your flag. Are you affiliated with this side or that side, or you don't want to take place at all in this debate, whatever debate might be unfolding? And it is a decision of the European Parliament, of the global parliament, of the global planetary parliament, in a way. So maybe this parliament isn't strong today, but considering the challenges that humanity is going to face in the 21st and 22nd century, these will be global issues, global problems that one individual country can't solve. So by building and strengthening this institution today, we might actually be laying foundations for a more efficient global solution, body of a global, which is tackling and solving global problems today, tomorrow, or in the next century. So we are building the house, so to say, by committing our attention and respect to however imperfect the current version of it is.
I see. Yeah, and another thing that I personally found very interesting was the speech given by the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, and he called the UN General Assembly a house of darkness and a swamp of anti-Semitic bile. So while he was giving the speech, a lot of world leaders and representatives just walked out, right? And while all the world leaders were gathered in New York, Israel launched an attack on Beirut, Lebanon's capital. Do you think it has any symbolic implications, right? I mean, when all the world leaders are gathered in one place, Israel goes on and attacks another country. Isn't it like a way of saying, I don't care what you think, I'm just going to do whatever I want?
It is. It's an insult. It's also subversion. So the idea of Israel is, or rather of Benjamin Netanyahu's government, is to subvert the United Nations and decrease their authority and perhaps even lead to its disappearance. There is a UN agency called UNRWA, UNRWA, which is an agency created to support Palestinian refugees. And Israel has declared it a terrorist organization. And only day before yesterday, Israel declared the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, persona non grata, so someone banned from entering Israel. You know, these steps are, no country ever took such extreme steps in when it comes to the United Nations. Criticizing, yes. Individual indictments, mainly for corruption, yes. But to do such a thing, never. And it displays contempt of Israel for United Nations, for everything it stands for, human rights, humanitarian law, which is blatantly disregarded and breaking in Gaza and now in Lebanon. And Israel would be far more comfortable in a world where might makes right.
I see. As you said, the UN Secretary General was banned from entering Israel. Don't you find irony in that? I mean, you know, like UN is basically the institution that legalized the establishment of Israel as a state. And now they're banning the head of the very same organization.
It is ingratitude, but it's also short-sightedness. You know, in its power, in its hegemony, regional hegemony in the Middle East, and the tested reliance on the United States. You know, they can cry for help at any moment and the cavalry will come. Israel has grown complacent and also smug. They believe they can, you know, destroy the order, the rules-based order, no matter how they want, you know, no matter the implications, however they want it. And they just don't see that they are destroying the order in which they were created and are creating also the danger for their country. So it's a very short-sighted policy that you apply when you think you're on top. But, you know, after every top comes a bottom. And, you know, the United Nations and multilateral diplomacy is supposed to protect us all from the anarchy in international relations, which Israel favors.
So moving on, I'd like to touch on the Security Council a little bit. So recently, the ambassador of the United States to the UN made a speech advocating for Africa joining the Security Council as permanent members, 2 nations from Africa as a permanent member of the Security Council. But the catch is she doesn't want to give any veto power to these countries. What's your stand on that? And don't you think it's like saying, inviting someone to the table and saying, well, you're not here to eat, you're just going to watch and watch us play with our food?
Yes, it's creating a first category country, second category country. Effectively, we already have these 2 categories, you know, the permanent members and the rest of the UN. And this is now creating another second category, which is permanent member, but without the special superpower that the permanent 5 have, and they are not eager to share it. So I do wonder, I mean, she did say, Linda Greenfield Thomas is her name, and she did say Africa. I do wonder if that will be her stance for India. Because, you know, when she says 2 countries from Africa, she doesn't name them. So, you can be insulted, but, you can't be insulted as a country because she didn't name you, even though we know which are the main contenders for this position. But I don't think she would dare to say India should join the become a permanent member, but without a veto. That would be insulting, and I'm not sure India would accept it, especially because India is in a superior position when it comes to bargaining. It's an important ally for United States, and they might say, well, if you don't want to give us the veto, we are not interested in the job. And in fact, we're not interested in another thing with you, right? They could withdraw or freeze their cooperation with the United States should they calculate that it's worth the risk, right? It's plenty of times you will find that bargaining is an important part in diplomacy, and that you need to show that you don't need them as much as they need you. So I believe India would be playing this game. The other contenders for the permanent seat, Germany and Japan, are considerably weaker than 20 years ago when this initiative started. So probably Japan. Germany, I'm not so sure. And also when it comes to veto, it would be insulting to accept this status of a lesser great power.
Yeah, don't you think Ambassador Greenfield knows it? I mean, I feel like as an ambassador, she knows that what she's proposing is very controversial, but they're still doing it. Why do you think that?
So as an ambassador, you actually don't have much of your own agency. You can't make your own decisions. You are acting according to the instructions you received from your Minister of Foreign Affairs or from your head of state, head of government, depends. So, you can't decide on your own. You know that what you're saying will create problems. You will write a report and a recommendation to your bosses, to your superiors, that it's going to create problems and what kinds of problems it might create. But ultimately, it's not your decision what you are going to say. It's the decision of foggy bottom, as is the expression for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the United States.
I see. And one last question. We touched upon a very important concept, which is the UN being criticized for being, quite ineffective, and the general public has lost its faith in the UN system as an institution, right? What's your stand on that?
My stand is that United Nations are only as powerful as the member states allow it to be. In order for United Nations to act properly and be able to stop wars, we all need to give up something of our national sovereignty. The problem is countries, governments, but also peoples in democracies are not ready to give up their sovereignty to a multilateral institution which they can't control. We can't have efficient United Nations if we do not accept its decisions, if we do not fund them, if we do not fund them unconditionally. Because sometimes, a country will say, like United States, I don't like what United Nations are doing, so I'm just going to stop giving them money. You are effectively undermining them. So it's a continuous struggle between sovereignty of individual member state countries and the protection of us all within multilateral diplomacy. So when people blame the United Nations, they shouldn't blame the organization. They should blame the people who are telling their nation states how to vote in the United Nations and what to prevent from happening.